Have you ever met anyone that you loved so much, and yet you knew you could never be worthy of their affection, of their love for you? Be it by money or personality confliction, or in my case, a timeline that I refused to interfere with. Well, I suppose I better start at the beginning. Have you ever read any My Little Pony fanfictions? Or more specifically, have you ever read the unbelievable amount of human and Equestria stories? Well, I used to, so long ago. We all know how they tend to start. The human would be at his house or walking through a convenient forest, when all of a sudden he would fall or sneeze or blink, and like that he ends up in either the Everfree Forest or Twilight's library. Cliché, right? Yeah, well, it wasn't for me. You see, unlike a wide amount of teenagers entering Equestria by some unknown means, I was barely into my teens at the time, or so I was told. I wish I could be more specific, but when I did come to Equestria, I found some of my memories lacking. Not all of them, but mostly the important ones, like my family, my age, and name. See where I'm going with this? Well, perhaps if I actually start explaining how I got here, then you'll understand a little better. It all started when I opened my eyes. I could only find myself in a broom closet. I was naturally confused, and to be honest, I was still asleep. So I imagined my surprise when I opened the door, only to find myself being stared at by numerous multicolored ponies. Multicolored ponies I couldn't help but recognize, most of whom were wearing armor. At the time, I was only around 5'6", but in comparison to these small creatures, I was quite tall. They made up for this quite well, however, by being both highly trained and, as I said, quite numerous. I should probably tell you what I look like, shouldn't I? Well, at the time, I had short, spiky brown hair that was never really changed over the years. I had, and obviously still have, bright green eyes, and I think at the time I was wearing a pair of blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and some white trainers. Anyway, I was dragged kicking and screaming by about 3 or 4 of the guards, one of which was grinding his teeth in frustration as his horn flickered on and off. After about 15 minutes of pulling, yelling, and cursing, the latter being from the ponies, believe it or not, I was thrown into a dank and dark cell. I still haven't told you my age at the time, have I? Forgive me, I can be quite forgetful. And given what has happened, well, by the end of this you might understand why. Anyway, back then I was only about 14, and my name... well, I only remembered my first one, and that made me more fearful than anything else that had happened to me that day. I mean, to have forgotten the really important parts of my life. I knew I had friends, but I couldn't remember their names. I knew I played rugby, but I couldn't remember for what team. And this and many more were forgotten, except for one ironic thing. The show I now resided in. I could remember the names of all the main 6, the princesses, the background ponies, most importantly every episode and the plot that came with it. As for my name, I waited in that cell for what felt like days, hiding myself as best I could while merely rested against the furthest corner. I was only a kid and I was terrified, despite knowing where I had to be. Believe it or not, I actually never wanted to go to Equestria. I mean, come on, I was still a kid with decent amount of friends and some grades at school. The door to the dungeon opened after what must have been a good hour or two. And who else would have stepped inside but Twilight Sparkle? Except she was little. She was just a little filly that couldn't have been any older than she was during her exam. This is not going the same way I thought it would have. Twilight walked close as she could to get to the bars and peered at me. I saw all of this through my fingers, said fingers being on my face in order to give me some sort of security.
"Ooh, what are you?" she asked excitedly. "I've never seen anything like you in my books before."
I didn't say anything back to her. I simply was too shocked, too frightened and wary of what was going to happen to me, despite not being able to remember their faces or names at that moment at all. All I wanted was my mom and dad. Say whatever you like. Yeah, I know I was 14, but I was so scared and alone in a world that shouldn't have existed. After a few minutes of non-stop talking and questioning from the purple filly, she was eventually interrupted by a rather sweet-sounding voice.
"Twilight, there you are. I've been looking all over for you."
I looked behind the small filly to see none other than Princess Cadence. She looked exactly as she did in the show. Her coat was a bright pink color, and her mane and tail consisted of 3 different colors, purple, pink, and golden highlights, all tied up in an ironic ponytail. But she was much younger than she was in the show. In fact, I could have sworn that at that moment she looked about the same age as she did in Twilight's flashbacks, where she was full-sitting her. She instantly noticed me huddled in the corner and walked over to the bars to join Twilight in her staring.
"Oh my, what in the world are you?"
she asked rhetorically. I didn't say anything to her either. It wasn't that she frightened me or anything like that. It's just, I was afraid to say something that would give my knowledge of this place away. I mean, if someone knew about the future in my world, then he or she would be arrested and interrogated until the day they died. I was pulled away from my thoughts by a rather large form coming up from behind the pair.
That is the question, is it not, Cadence?
Both Cadence and Twilight jumped in surprise and turned to see Princess Celestia smiling down at them. Said princess looked at me with the same kind smile and used her magic to unlock the bars before she walked inside and stopped a short distance in front of me. Her horn glowed yet again for a few seconds, and I was instantly surrounded by a golden aura, only for it to instantly fade away. She tilted her head in slight confusion at this and lit up her horn again, only for the exact same thing to happen.
How interesting,
she muttered quietly. So quietly, in fact, I only managed to hear her. Cadence and Twilight merely sat at the entrance and watched. I still hadn't removed my hands from my face. I was even more afraid and needed some comfort, no matter how mediocre. Celestia suddenly moved forward and touched my leg with her hoof, surprising me and making me jump as a result. To my utter surprise, however, it was Celestia herself who was the most affected. Her ethereal mane instantly stopped blowing in the non-existent breeze and rapidly turned to a bright pink color. She then removed her hoof from me, and, well, like magic, her mane instantly regained its flow and color.
I thought so. You're completely immune to magic, she told me, a touch of nervousness in her voice. But I could feel my magic at work, almost. Perhaps... Princess, what's wrong with your magic? Twilight asked curiously, her eyes sparkling at the anticipation of new knowledge. Cadence was merely looking at me strangely. Celestia looked at her student and smiled reflectively at her, something that seemed to have an instant calming effect on the unicorn. I believe this creature is completely immune to any kind of magic, she explained calmly. But there's never been a creature completely immune to magic, Twilight stammered nervously, showing her intelligence despite her young age. Even dragons aren't completely immune. Indeed, Twilight. That would mean this creature is not of this world, Celestia mused, half to herself and half to her student. Really, Auntie? Cadence asked, apparently deciding to speak up now that she had stopped staring at me. Is this thing an alien, then? She continued excitedly. As they spoke to each other, my mind was racing to find some sort of solution to the problem. A part of me considered asking Celestia if she could send me home, but by the sound of it, this type of thing had never happened before. So what would she know in terms of sending me back? No, if she learned that I could speak, then she might not ever let me go, especially if her magic was completely useless against me. The other part of me was highly considering making a run for it, because if I was immune to magic, then Celestia had no way of stopping me, and despite her guards being stronger than me, I doubted they were as fast. I could still remember my place on my team, wherever they were. I didn't need to speak, just run. I suddenly became aware of Celestia looking down at me again, and looked back at her, my hands still on my face protectively. The princess did something quite peculiar. She laid down on her stomach in front of me, and merely looked down at what little she could see of my face. Can you understand me? She asked softly. I blinked at the question instinctively and shuffled around almost unnoticeably. Celestia smiled at this and continued to look at me. Ah, so you can then, she continued softly. I am Princess Celestia, and ruler of Equestria, which is the world you now reside in. Could you perchance look at me, please? I honestly didn't know what to do. I kept looking at the open door and tensing my legs as I considered making a break for it. Celestia apparently noticed this as she put her forehoof on my leg, distracting me and causing her mane to lose its magical properties. Please, I promise you that I mean no harm, she pleaded gently. Despite a rather large part of me screaming at me not to, I took my hands off my face and allowed every pony to look at it properly. Celestia smiled at this and put a hoof on my cheek, turning my face to different angles as to get a better look at me. You're quite young, aren't you? She mused absent-mindedly. If I were to guess, I'd say the same age as Cadence, perhaps younger, perhaps older. As the other magic word was somehow spoken, Cadence trotted over to me and peered at me curiously, smiling the whole time. Twilight walked behind her and clung to her left hind leg as she looked at me inquisitively. Celestia then stopped moving my head and gave me a motherly smile. It gave me the weirdest sense of déjà vu that I have ever recalled. Can you speak? She asked me softly, smiling at me and almost electing a small smile of my own in return.
I considered the consequences of speaking, but to be honest, she already knew that I was intelligent, so I was doomed either way, really. Yes, I replied nervously, my voice breaking down halfway through the word. The princess let loose a rather large smile as I spoke, apparently either quite happy that she was making progress, or just happy that her scientific find of the millennia was capable of speech. Your voice is breaking, Cadence giggled musically, making me go red and glare at her irritably. She didn't seem to care. Yeah, it happens, I murmured quietly. To be honest, I was surprised that I remembered what my voice breaking actually meant. Well, that means you're going through puberty then, which would make you about 13, perhaps 14, Celestia explained smoothly, though she did chuckle a bit herself. I'd say 14, Auntie, Celestia added helpfully. Some colts at school are 13, and none of their voices are like his yet. Same age as you, then, Celestia declared cheerfully before looking back at me and adding, unless you'd care to tell us your age yourself? I don't know, I replied nervously. Celestia frowned at me curiously and took her hoof off my leg, something that I didn't realize until she did so, and her mane returned back to normal. What do you mean? She asked questioningly. I don't remember my age, or much else to be honest, I informed her sheepishly. Celestia blinked in surprise at this, as did Cadence, who looked at me with a rather sad expression. So you don't remember anything? She asked morosely. I scrunched up my face in concentration and tried to recall all that I could, but it wasn't much. I remember my first name, my school, I play rugby, and, well, not much else apart from the blurs. I was lying, of course. I still remembered the show and what was going to happen to Cadence when she eventually married Shining Armor, as well as Luna returning, Twilight eventually becoming a princess, and everything else. What's rugby? Cadence asked curiously, snapping me out of my thoughts and causing me to notice Celestia and Twilight looking at me expectantly. It's a type of sport that involves two teams, a really weirdly shaped ball that we pass around, and actually that's all I remember. Cadence frowned at me worriedly for all of about 5 seconds before she smiled and began to bounce on the spot. Well, then I suppose you'll just have to make new memories, she explained enthusiastically. Celestia smiled at her enthusiasm and nodded in agreement. Indeed, perhaps time spent doing other activities will help you remember your forgotten past, she pondered out loud before shaking her head and standing up quickly. On another note, we've been talking in this dungeon for a while, so let's leave here and find a more comfortable environment. She looked down at me and offered her hoof for me to grasp. I hesitated and bit my lip nervously, and then I was pushed awkwardly onto my knees by Cadence. Whoa! I proclaimed loudly. I certainly didn't expect that to happen. I remember frowning unhappily at the young alicorn, but she was merely smiling cheerfully while she motioned for me to stand. Come on, stand up, or do you prefer the dirt? She asked teasingly. I just rolled my eyes, but smiled at her and stood up to my full height, which, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't very tall on Earth, but here I was only an inch smaller than Celestia, and could easily look at her face without straining my neck. Said princess was running her eyes over my body almost questioningly before she finally focused on my face and smiled comfortingly. It's not often that I meet an individual who can talk to me at eye level, she told me, a small smirk on her muzzle. Although if you're only 14, then I would imagine you have yet to reach your full height. Celestia just smiled at me and shook her head before walking out of the cell with Cadence and Twilight in tow. Cadence looked back at me and gave an exaggerated groan. Then, before I had a chance to so much as blink, she grabbed my hands and was pulling me with her. She was still pulling me when we entered a large bedroom 10 minutes or so later. Well then, I suppose we should arrange where you're staying, Celestia said. Staying? I replied questioningly. I didn't want to stay, I wanted to go home. Is there no way for me to just go home? I asked desperately. Celestia's calm smile dissolved into a rather somber frown as she shook her head. I don't even know from where you arrived, young creature. And if you're really from another world, then I don't believe there's a spell in all of Equestria that can help you go home. And like that, my hopes were crushed. I felt tears creeping their way under the corners of my eyes while my hand began to shake. But before I could completely break down, I found myself being pushed onto the bed in a sitting position, and embraced by the bright pink alicorn. What are you doing? I asked her questioningly. Cadence looked at me bemusedly, albeit with a sad smile, and then said one thing I'll never forget. Making you smile again. And to my disbelief, she was right.
Despite the soul-crushing fact that I could never go back to my home, to my family, my friends, and whatever else I had yet to remember, her display of affection, however unwanted it may have been, made me smile. "Alexander," I muttered thankfully. "Pardon?" Cadence asked, raising an eyebrow curiously. "Alexander. My name's Alexander, or Alex to my friends." I thought unsuredly. Cadence smiled at me and replied in kind. "I'm Princess Miyamore Cadenza, or just Cadence to my friends." Her magenta-colored eyes met my own and twinkled playfully, something that made me forget about my sadness for a moment. "It's nice to meet you then, Cadence," I quipped bemusedly, holding out my hand for her to shake. "Likewise, Alex," she replied, shaking my hand and smiling humorously. And that was how we met. It took a few weeks, but Celestia pulled some strings within her court, and I was eventually given the all-clear to go out and meet the locals without the fear of inciting a massive panic. Cadence and Twilight had been keeping me company all the time, minus whenever Cadence had school and Twilight had a lesson with her teacher. Cadence was absolutely hilarious. I still don't remember having met anyone with her attitude. She was witty, kind, and not afraid to speak her mind. She was really good with Twilight, and she knew how to make her smile, and she knew how to wipe away the tears and cheer her up. Not to mention, they had a very familiar and adorable dance. She was also very supportive of me during my time of distress. Despite having been told of its impossibility, I still ached to go home. I missed my parents terribly, and the dreams I had of them only served to increase my depression. But Cadence helped me, and when I was allowed to leave the place and venture around Canterlot, she stuck by me and showed me some of the more exciting things in the otherwise boring city of nobles. She was also seriously competitive. We visited a really retro arcade where she kicked my ass at nearly every game there, minus Pac-Mare. I still don't think any pony has beaten my high score at that yet. We also visited a really nice ice cream parlor that gave both of us a massive scoop of dairy goodness. Cadence had the rum raisin while I had the hazelnut. It tasted like chocolate spread. And I eventually had to return to the castle, where to my surprise she lived as well. She promised to find a way for us to hang out more often. "It'd be nice if we could see each other more," she said wistfully, and to my utter surprise, she did find a way on exactly the next day. She came into my room and more or less yanked me out of bed with nothing more than my boxers on and took me to the throne room. I think it took a good hour for Celestia to stop laughing, but once she did, she explained to me that she could enroll me in the same school as Cadence. I would have to take extra lessons in order to bring me up to speed on what most foals learned in what was honestly called preschool, but simple stuff like equus, which was basically English, and mathematics would be available for me to learn, if I wanted to. I wanted to. And so began a life of school, friends, bullies, and homework. So much homework. Celestia had done a public announcement in which she more or less said that she was my guardian, and to hurt me was to hurt her. Not that she actually needed to say anything. Cadence was a huge help for me during my first few months, acting as what I think a very best friend would act like. She steered me away from the bad side, where all the horses and jocks stood, rutted, and smoked. Yeah, I was shocked too. I would have thought smoking would have been non-existent here, but there you go. Anyway, it wasn't just them that I had to worry about. There were a few times a rather arrogant unicorn would try to pick a fight with me, only to realize that his magic had no effect whatsoever and run with his tail between his legs, literally. But at other times there was an earth pony or a pegasus that felt like they had something to prove. And apparently I had a temper, as some of the idiotic ponies came to realize. But as I got older, my temper lessened, and with Cadence's help, I learned to keep my cool. As for Cadence herself, well, to my absolute surprise, she was treated quite badly by some ponies. I would have thought her to be one of the popular ones, but she was more akin to a nerdy girl then, I thought. Not that it bothered me, she was my best friend and always had my back. Now, I bet you're wondering where Shining Armor comes into all this. Well, he's one of my friends too. Cadence introduced us on my first day here, and to my surprise, he was actually a lot more present to me than I thought him to be. Unlike Cadence, however, he tended to help me beat the shit out of any pony who got too much in my face. We were good friends, not as close as Cadence, but I wouldn't trade his friendship for any other. Cadence and he got on quite well, too. She teased him endlessly with her witty humor, while he took it all in and rebuffed her with his own jokes. It wasn't hard to see why they would fancy each other. School was brilliant, so much more than any fragmented memory I could recover from home. I learned quite a bit, too, much more than I would ever learn by simply watching the show. Like I said before, eventually the days began to meld into each other, and the next thing I knew I was 17, and in my last day of school.
It was the last day, which was fantastic news, right? Well, there was one problem, one that I had tried my absolute hardest to ignore, especially over the past few months where it had become more apparent. Princess Cadence liked me, and when I say liked, I mean she liked me, and not Shining Armor. It was small and innocent at first, like the time when I had just gotten out of a fight with a rather pompous unicorn. He had managed to cut my cheek showishly with his horn, which was quickly reflected by my fist nearly breaking the thing in two. Anyway, after Cadence pulled me off of him, took me into an empty classroom and scolded me near to death, she slowly began to clean the cut. She was really gentle, too, wiping it ever so tenderly with a damp cloth before she put the small plaster over it and pecked quickly with her lips. "It'll heal better," she explained, with a small but noticeable blush on her cheeks. And then there was the other time when we were just laying under the shade of an oak tree talking about whatever we could think of to pass the time. I was so engrossed in our conversation that I didn't really notice how close she was lying next to me. It was only when she rested her head on my shoulder that I realized, but even then I didn't think anything of it. The ponies here were quite affectionate at times, so getting nuzzled by Cadence was nothing new to me. But looking back at it now, I really feel like a fool for never really paying attention to her soft moans of happiness as I absent-mindedly stroked her back, or the playful twinkle in her magenta eyes as she stared at me innocently. Honestly, I just thought she was being plain old friendly Cadence. But then the small things started to become more noticeable. There was a couple days where Cadence had come down with some sort of magical cold called, well, magic cold. A magic cold is basically the same as a really bad cold, except instead of snot, you sneeze and dribble out magical sparks that can have various effects on other ponies. But seeing as magic had no effect on me, Celestia and most of the doctors asked if I would keep watch over the sick mare and help her while she needed it. I was 16 at the time, as was she. My birthday was unknown, and so Celestia had just decided to mark my arrival as the day I was born. Cadence's birthday was only a couple months after my own, so we were more or less always the same age. Anyway, I got off school for a few days as a result, whilst being able to talk to Cadence, so I saw no reason not to. And besides, she was my best friend, and friends take care of each other. Anyways, I spent my next few days taking care of the sick mare. Her magic hold was making it almost impossible for her to do the simplest tasks, like making herself something to eat or focus on her homework. Washing herself was also something she found difficult, and so I helped her with it, albeit blushing like a tomato the whole time, but Cadence found it relaxing, and with her aching joints, my touch must have felt like a godsend. I did leave the more intimate parts of her body alone, however. No amount of persuading would have convinced me to wash that. And like I said, the small things escalated to become quite noticeable. It was just after I'd helped her get into bed. I was tucking her in when she put a hoof to my hand and just stared at me intently. "I need to thank you for looking after me," she said sweetly, sniffing back whatever sparks were dying to come out. "It's been no trouble, Cadence, honestly," I replied truthfully. The mare just smiled and blushed faintly as she bit her lip, staring at me with her still, kind eyes. Could you stay with me tonight?" she asked nervously. I blinked at this odd request, but smiled and nodded. Okay, I'll take the couch." I was about to make my way over to said couch, but was stopped by Cadence gripping my right hand with both hooves. "I didn't mean the couch, Alex," she admitted shyly, her blush darkening as I finally realized what she meant. "Oh," I mouthed quietly. You don't have to," she explained quickly. I didn't even get a chance to say anything back. "It was a silly thought, Alex," she ranted rapidly. Cadence, it really doesn't matter anyway, so don't worry about it," she continued, almost falling over her words at the speed with which she said them. "Cadence, it must be the magic hold. It is making me say things I shouldn't, and Cadence!" The teenage alicorn stopped her ranting and merely looked up at me nervously, her eyes wide and doe-like, while her cheeks were tinged between pink and red. "Should I keep my top on or off?" I asked cheekily, prompting an even greater tinge of red from the mare. "Off is fine," she replied sheepishly, a small smile worming its way onto her muzzle. I did as she asked and took my t-shirt off. I wasn't wearing any footwear, and so I had no need to worry about that. Anyway, I climbed onto her bed and laid down a short distance from her, unsure of whether or not to get any closer. Cadence, it seemed, was not unsure. She wiggled her way over to me and rested her head on my chest, sniffing back a few magic sparks while the others landed on me and fizzled out of existence. It kinda tickled, actually. "You don't mind me doing this, do you?" she asked nervously, lifting her head from my chest with a concerned look in her eyes.
I mean, I just kind of get cold sometimes, and with this magic hold, it's a bit harder to get warm, but I can move away if it's making you uncomfortable, and I shushed her by placing my finger on her lips, surprising the mare into incoherent mumbles as she tried to continue talking. If you're cold, then get close. We can share our body heat, I advised uncertainly. Cadence blinked in surprise at this and ducked her head in an attempt to hide her smile. Okay, she stuttered cutely. The alicorn snuggled her head back into my chest and sighed happily, still sniffing somewhat from what I think was the magic hold. I put my arm around her and stroked her back soothingly in an attempt to ease out any of the aches that were bothering her. This resulted in a half-asleep, "Thanks, Alex," before she began to snore very quietly. Believe it or not, she got better the next day, and if I was still in any way uncertain of her affections towards me, then what happened on what was literally called Pony Prom Night changed that forever. Alrighty guys, that was the first part of Nothing is Set in Stone. There's going to be 4 parts total to this one. Thank you so much for being here with me. I really hope you enjoyed this. I want to thank you guys a ton for the 200 subscribers, and as always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Peace.